man charged with conducting part of that operation will be Chris Adriaansen, Director of the Australian Plague Locust Commission. And Chris is on the line now. Chris, good afternoon to you first, but it would seem to be an ever-growingly difficult task, Chris, given the revised dates we see of hatchings that have come out.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, certainly it's not going to be any easier, and the forecast hatchings that we revised last week indicate that there will be some protracted hatching periods as well as a bit of a patchwork of hatching. Normally in a fairly good and straightforward situational season, we would find that hatchings would be from the north to the south in response to the increasing spring temperatures. But certainly what we're seeing is some variation in those temperatures and also a fairly significant impact from the repeated rainfall that we're getting across the area.
Chris, we're talking about an operation here that will need to be coordinated between multiple states with multiple budgets, also different needs. But I have a look at the information regarding hatching dates, and we're talking about a time span from early September to late October in some instances. How difficult will this be to coordinate?
Well, certainly. I mean, the work that we've been doing for quite a few months now between the states and the Australian Plague Locust Commission has been focused on the fact that, we will have multiple operations running concurrently, and then also some operations that will obviously be separated by time and distance. But the whole idea of working this planning process, getting everything we possibly can together well in advance of the start of the hatchings has been to try and make sure that we've got all the potential gaps identified and those gaps adequately filled. So yes, it does add some complexity. Obviously, the Australian Plague Locust Commission has a particular mandate and objective in terms of managing and monitoring populations that pose an interstate threat, but we've also been trying to make sure that the state agencies have got all of the resources that they need and the plans in place to be able to effectively respond within their own areas.
Yeah, Chris, with the big rainfall through the north of South Australia there, like Lyndhurst, Maree was supposed to be about the first hatching area. How long is that likely to delay it, or is it just likely to spread it out over a longer period of time?
Potentially, Rob, it'll prolong the hatching period. We've just been looking at some information this morning, in fact, particularly in relation to South Australia, southern New South Wales and also Victoria. And we've been looking at, amongst other things, the egg samples that we've taken and received from a number of those locations. What we're finding is that the eggs that have been laid in sandier soils, even with the rainfall, those soils have been draining. The top 5 to 10 centimetres has been draining quite well. And so as a consequence, those soils have been reacting to the change in ambient temperature quite solidly. As a consequence, they've been warming up. The eggs have continued to develop, so those eggs will hatch probably around about the scheduled time, maybe plus or minus a few days. Obviously it's not that precise, and the dates that we give are peak hatching times only. But where we've got heavier soils, those soils are not draining as well, and so where they're staying moist, the soil is not responding to ambient temperature as quickly. So we're seeing some protracted development. In the sandier soils, particularly, say, northwestern Victoria, we're finding that the eggs are at stage 8 and stage 9, which means that they're only a couple of weeks or so off potentially hatching. Whereas further north, where you would expect them to be more developed in the heavier soils, they're still at stage 4 and 5, so they've still got quite a few weeks, 3 to 4 weeks at least before they hatch. So it just adds to the complexity, not only for the state agencies and ourselves, but also for landholders.
And I suppose that complexity may well have an impact in greater demand on chemical as the season goes by. Are you confident with the quantities of chemical and the number of aircraft you've got?
Look, I mean, between, again, the state agencies and APLC, that's obviously been a fairly significant part of the planning process, is to make sure that we've got the resources in place. The orders for the chemical pesticides, in fact for all of the pesticides, were placed very early. And we've certainly got on hand already the supplies of the chemical pesticides that we need. In terms of aircraft, again, working across the agencies to make sure that we're not all competing for the same limited resource. There are sufficient aircraft. The one factor that we have been finding for the last couple of years, and we'll find again this year, is it's not so much the aircraft that are limited, it's the experienced pilots. Because with the vagaries of the agricultural system, obviously a number of those experienced pilots have sought employment elsewhere in the commercial sector rather than rely on the up and down of agricultural aerial use. So that's been one of the issues we've been dealing with as part of the planning process. We have had that little bit of a glitch that became evident shortly a little while ago with regard to the biopesticide Green Guard, where the manufacturer had a manufacturing problem, and so we've got a little bit of delay in some of that respect. But again, working between the agencies, we've been trying to make sure that we've got effectively got each other covered as best we possibly can, even in the face of that limited supply.
Are there any early hatchings yet in that Marie area?
We've had a couple of unconfirmed reports of some hatchings, but we've had similar reports in some areas of New South Wales. And in checking out some of those reports in New South Wales, we found a mixture of species there, including occasional Australian plague locusts, but there's a mixture of species that have been coming up there at that time. So we've got a couple of unconfirmed reports further north in South Australia. Biggest problem that we've got, and this goes right across the board, is access to be able to check those out. We've had some teams out last week, and in fact we had to call them back to their field bases. In one case, they basically had to hole up in a country town in southwestern Queensland for a few days, simply because they can't get in or out of the areas that we need to survey. So we're going to have to wait for a little bit longer in those areas, wait for another 7 to 10 days when hopefully the densities will be sizable enough that we're able to put an aeroplane over the area and spot the high density bands from the air rather than having to rely on ground survey, which is just not going to happen for a while yet.
Yeah, is there any, like with satellite technology and that type of thing, as they hatch, do you get any technological help with that?
No, not from that respect, because I mean, you really the only thing when they become visible from the air is when they are of their highest density and when obviously they gather together, they aggregate into those marching bands. Then you can see both the bands themselves, but also potentially some of the damage that they leave behind those bands. So you really do need to wait for a period of weeks before you start to get any aerially visible impact or presence. So you know, we really have to rely upon reports and then ground surveillance to be able to check the situation out for the first few weeks after hatching.
Chris, how soon will you be able to have any determination of the relative success of the measures that are being undertaken here?
Look, I mean, obviously this is going to be a reasonably sizable campaign across multiple agencies, multiple jurisdictions, and it will take a considerable amount of time to be able to work through. You know, we've got a period there of you know, anything up to 3 months between the start of hatching and when the first generation will start to hit the wing and start to swarm. One of the things that we're making sure that people are very much aware of right at the very start is that regardless of the success of minimising the damage of these locusts, the numbers are such that with the 30 or 40% of low-density population that remains untreated simply because we don't undertake prophylactic blanket spraying, we only attack the highest density infestations. So there's always 30 to 40% of the population that remains untreated. Now, in a normal situation with a normal low to moderate population at the start, 30 to 40% is, yeah, it's reasonable, but it's not incredibly impressive. With the numbers that we're talking about potentially hatching in spring, 30 to 40% of that population is still an awful lot of locusts. It's still billions of locusts. And so we will see swarms at the end of spring. And what that means is that we'll have to then assess the situation, determine whether or not swarm control might be undertaken to any effect, or whether basically we've got to come back and do another generation of control in early summer.
Well, Chris, we do wish you all the best, and no doubt we'll check in again sometime perhaps later in the month or early next month, and we hope for some good news then. Chris, thanks for your time.